Warm up a little bit? No, a little bit. Now I gotta sit still. Okay, we're gonna get rolling. So we have been hanging out, as you guys know, in the Gospel of Mark, and we've been looking at Mark's account of the life and story of Jesus. And kind of up to this point, Mark has really just kind of made this bold claim that Jesus is the Son of God, that He is God incarnate, who came to earth to rule and to reign, is come to serve, but then is going to rule and reign as this promised Messiah. And so today, the passage we're going to be in, we're going to look at this idea of the authority of Jesus. The authority of Jesus. And just a few observations for us as we think about the authority of Jesus and authority just in general. A few observations I think that'll help kind of get our minds in the right place. First and foremost is that we have to recognize that we all have authority in our life. We all have authority in our life. And authority, one way of defining authority is just that it's the power to influence or command thoughts, opinions, or behaviors. And so we see this, right? We're probably well aware of some of the authority in our life. So we live in a country where there's a government that has authority to make up laws that will dictate how we live. For many of us, in our work situations, we work for people, and so they dictate a lot of conditions and things at work. They have an authority within the work place. For many of us in our relationships, there is an authority in the relationships. Probably the most clear of that is between a parent and a child. That there's authority that the parent has for the child. So authority shows up in many places in our life and in many different ways. And really, I think a better definition, and I really like this definition of authority, and this is the one we're going to work off of today. So if you're going to write down a definition, here's the one to write down. Authority in our life will determine how we think and how we live. Like that's why authority is so important. That's why this idea of authority is so big, because the authority that we have, right? The one that we give that place of authority to in our life, is going to determine the way that we think and how we live our lives. And so it's important that we have the right authority, that we're listening to the right authority, because if not, we're going to get influenced. The way that we think and the way that we're going to live is going to be influenced in a negative, in a bad way. Second observation that we need to note as it has to do with authority is that we all reject authority in our life. We all reject authority in our life. And we see this all the time, right? In our own lives. I see it on a regular basis with my little ones, right? And how there's just this, Dad will say do this, but then there's something, this innate nature that I don't want to do that. I want to do my own thing. I want to do something against the authority, and so then there's consequences for that, right? But before we get too hard on our kids, we do the same thing, don't we? Right? I was trying to think of an example this week to display that, and I was talking with my buddy Joe. Joe's one of our elders at Bedrock Roanoke, and I was going to use this illustration. He was an airline pilot. He was a fighter pilot for many years, and so I was going to use this picture of the commanding officer and all that sort of stuff. And he's like, "Well, if you really want a picture that's going to land with people," he said, "think about how we drive on a regular basis, right?" So we're gonna put on our imagination caps for just a minute, okay? I want to make this practical so that we all kind of understand this push against authority that we struggle with. Okay, so let's imagine that we're leaving the Henry Fork Center today, and we're going to drive to Roanoke. We're going to go eat at Roanoke. Somebody throw it out. Where are we going to go eat at? We can't go to Chick-fil-A today. They're closed on Sunday. Kanye even made a song about it. McDonald's. Well, we have a McDonald's here. We're somewhere in Roanoke that we would drive to Roanoke. Where? Texas Roadhouse. All right, we're going to go to Texas Roadhouse. We're going to get some of those delicious rolls with that cinnamon butter and some peanuts, right? And a big old juicy steak and potato. Okay? So we're driving, and we make it out of Rocky Mount, and we come into the grand town of Boone's Mill, right? And we're really hungry at this point, right? Like our stomach's growling. We got to beat all the other church people there, right? Because we don't want to wait in line. And so, we're like, okay, we're just going to push the pedal down a little bit. So we drive through Boone's Mill. And anybody who's drove through Boone's Mill, what happens when we get through Boone's Mill going too fast? Yeah, we see the Charger, right? We see those flashing lights, right? And in that moment, right, when those flashing lights come on, we have a decision to make. Am I going to follow this authority? Am I going to pull over, right? Or am I going to try to just say, you know what, I'm not going to listen to that authority, and I'm going to do my own thing and keep driving. Now, we all know what would happen if we kept doing that, right? But here's the other thing that I know. When we get pulled over, and that officer gets out of the car and asks us, sir, do you know why I pulled you over? And we all know, right? But we're like, I have no idea. Were my flashers on? I have no idea. Why did you pull me over? Right? And he says, well, you were going 47 in a 45, and you're breaking the speed limit, right? And anybody who's been through Boone's Mill, no, that's kind of what it is. You have to slow down there. But there's this thing inside of us that wants to come up with excuses, that wants to reject that authority, right? We all want to say, yeah, but I had both hands on the wheel. I was driving safe, right? I wasn't swerving. But officer, you don't understand. I had to get to somewhere really, really important. Those cinnamon rolls, those bread rolls were just calling my name. Whatever it may be, right? We all have this innate thing inside of us that just wants to reject that authority in our life. And it's smaller consequences, you know, like a speeding ticket, like that's not a great thing to get, but that's a small consequence. But when we reject the authority of God in our life, the consequences are much, much higher. And this is exactly what Jesus is going to address in our passage today. And really, this picture of rejecting authority, it's not just something that's unique to us. It goes back, as we do so many times, it goes all the way back to the beginning, right? Like that's exactly that picture in the garden that we see when Adam and Eve had that moment in the garden, right? And in the moment in the garden, they had that decision to make. Am I going to trust the authority of God who has said that this tree, that I shouldn't eat from it? Or am I going to try to do it my own way? Do I think that my authority is somehow higher than God's authority? Am I going to reject the authority of God that has told me not to eat of this? And of course, we all know that story, right? We all know how that story turned out. Humanity rejected the authority of God, and we've been paying the price for that ever since then. Here's a few things that we need to realize. When you are the creator of the universe, then you have absolute authority over all of your creation, right? A lot of people will push back and say, who does God think he is, that he can tell us how to live our lives? So we're not robots. We have choice. How can God tell us how to live our lives? Well, he can tell us how to live our lives because he is our creator. He's the one that created everything, and so he has the authority. Second thing we need to realize as we enter into this idea of authority is that we don't need to reject authority, but we do need a better authority. You see, most of the time when we have a problem with authority, it's not because of the authority, it's because it's not a very good authority. There are a lot of authorities in our life that are not great authorities, and we give them that place of authority in our life, and we'll talk through some of those in a practical way here in just a few minutes. But we don't need to reject authority altogether, but we do need a better authority. Third observation that we need to realize about authority is that we live in a culture that rejects absolute authority. By and large, our culture rejects absolute authority. Let me just say, this is not something that's new, okay? Ever since that moment in Genesis 3, we've been rejecting authority. But we have, in the last, I would say 5-10 years, have put that rejection of authority on display in a way that has not maybe been seen in other times, right? There's a boldness, there's almost a elevation in our culture to reject any authority or the idea of absolute authority. See, there's this term that came about maybe in the last 15 years or so called relativism. You guys are familiar with that? It goes something like this. It's the mindset that what's true for you may be true for you, and what's true for me may be true for me, but it's all relative based on who you are. And so my truth is not going to affect you, and your truth is not going to affect me. So what may be true for me is true, but that may not be true for you. Does that make sense? Well, it doesn't really make sense, but you understand what I'm saying, right? It's a relativistic mindset. It's the idea that everything is relative. It's an ideology that everything is based on the individual. And the individual, what the individual believes is the absolute authority in their life. And so we say things like, you do you, right? There's these phrases that we have, right? Or I'm going to do me. I'm going to do my own thing because I'm not going to be influenced by what you do or what someone else does. Or we say things like, what's true for you, right? That thing may be true for you. That may be your reality. That may be your truth. That may be your authority. But that doesn't mean that it's mine. And so we live in this tension, in this culture that has rejected absolute truth and lives in relativistic or relative truth, right? And kind of the front man for this idea, the one that as pastors we always go to, I heard somebody this week call him, what do they call him? A pastor's favorite atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche, right? He's the one that always gets quoted, right? But he said this, and I think this really sums it up well. He says, there are no eternal facts as there are not absolute truths, right? So when we reject the idea that there's any sort of absolute truth that's a universal truth for all of creation, for everyone, then the idea of absolute authority kind of goes by the wayside as well. Those two kind of hinge on each other. Okay, so I want to give us a minute to start thinking about this in our lives. Okay, and then we're going to get into Jesus' story, into the text here. Okay, here's what I want us to think about for just a minute. What are the sources of authority in our lives? Let's take a minute and think about that. If you need to stand up or kind of jog in place for that minute to warm up, that's fine too. By the way, if you're watching this at home, like you probably made a good choice this morning. You're nice and toasty. But for everybody else, we're going to make it happen this morning. But think about that. What are those sources of authority in our lives? We're going to write those down in just a minute. So let me give you a minute to think about that. When you're freezing cold, a minute seems like a long time. So we're going to go ahead and start rolling on this. So what are some of the authorities that we have in our lives? Just kind of shout them out. Wow, okay. Smart. Bible. Judges. I thought you were talking about your Old Testament reading. I'm like, you're way ahead. Talking about the book of Judges. But yes, Judges. Judges. Parents, I heard. One more time. Boss. Okay, police. Anyone who is bigger than you, maybe. That's not always true, though. Sometimes it's the smaller frame people that are, I could tell stories about that all day long. Government, that's good. Ooh, elders. King, like it. Yeah, how do we forget God? We're at church, folks. Come on. Thank you, Naomi. Was that Naomi? It was Noah. Okay, I heard it coming over that way. Anything else? I can't believe you guys. We forgot God. Come on. Yeah, thank you, children. All right. So these are good, and we could probably add many other things, right? There are many other relationships and situations that we may be in where there's an authority over us, where we have to submit to those. And as we think through this list of things, right? These are all people in relationships in our life where they have some sort of authority, right, to tell us to do different things in our life. And so, I'll put this one. This is pretty big too, especially when we're in that I was talking to a good friend yesterday, especially when we're in that middle school to high school age, our friends, even though it may not be the authority, but what they say has so much authority about the way we think about ourselves and interpret how we think about ourselves, right? And those are really good specific examples. This morning I want to give us just real quickly a couple of general categories of things that people will say is their source of authority, that these are just very general categories, right? So number one is reason. And it goes something like this. I live the way I live because I think, right? Whatever I think about becomes the authority. And so if I think a certain way, that's going to influence how I live my life. Okay? Second big category we have is experience. Some people will say, I live the way I live because I feel, right? I've had this experience, I've lived through this, I feel a certain way, and so my feelings or my experience that I've had is going to determine the way that I live and the choices that I make. The third general category that we would have this morning is tradition. I live the way I live because we have always done it this way. Right? You guys ever heard that before? Yeah? Right? And again, not that any three of these are necessarily bad authorities. Like, I think that they should all play a role. But when we're thinking about absolute authorities, right, we have one other category, and that's revelation. I live the way I live because God says so. Because it is God's word, it's God's revelation, it's His word to me that's going to determine how I live my life. And so, as we walk through the story today, I want us to keep those categories in our mind because they're going to come up again as we kind of read through this. And so, the big question we want to answer today from our passage in Mark chapter 1 is this: why should Jesus be the absolute authority in my life? Why should Jesus be the absolute authority in my life? Okay? And very quickly, I just want to answer that for us, and then we're going to look at this story. I know I keep promising we're going to get there. But the reason that Jesus should be the absolute authority in our life is because of who He claims to be. Is because of who He claims to be. Remember, we've already said this morning that the Creator should have absolute authority over His creation. We've also said that we don't need to reject authority, but we need a better authority, right? And so Jesus' claims as to who He is the reason that we should have Him as the absolute authority in our life. So who has He claimed to be? Well, very quickly, we've seen so far in Mark chapter 1, Mark tells us that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right? We talked about that Christ, that promised Messiah, the Son of God. So there's already this claim that Jesus is God. Right? That's essentially what He's claiming. And then we see in Mark chapter 1, verse 11, in His baptism story, when there's a voice coming from heaven that confirms this. God the Father says that Jesus is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. In our passage today, in Mark 1:24, the demons confirm this by calling Jesus the Holy One of God. In the next chapter, in Mark chapter 2, verse 10, Jesus is going to say, to claim His authority, He's going to say in verse 10, He's going to say, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He's going to make this very bold claim to have authority to forgive sins. And then in chapter 2, verse 27 and 28, Jesus is going to say to them that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, referring to Himself, is even Lord of the Sabbath. And that may not mean a whole lot to us, but there's a whole lot of background behind those verses and those claims. Essentially, Jesus is claiming to be God. He's making this bold claim to be the Creator God who created everything. And so He should have absolute authority. And so if these statements are true that Jesus makes, and if you keep reading throughout Mark's account, he's going to claim over and over to have this authority. I just wanted to give us the immediate context. But if these statements are true, my only response is to give Him authority in my life. Okay? And so today we're going to be in Mark chapter 1. We're going to be looking at verses, I believe, 22, and we're going to go all the way down today through verse 34. Verse 34. And we're going to see how Jesus makes these commands, makes this demand for authority in our life. And so first, we're going to see that Jesus' words demand absolute authority to Him. Here's what it says in Mark chapter 1, verse 21 and 22. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath He entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at His teaching, for He taught them as one who had authority, not as the scribes. Okay? So what's happening? Well, Jesus is showing up on the religious day, right? It's the Sabbath. It's the religious day for them. So it would be Saturday in the Jewish world. This was Saturday, the day that they worshiped. This was the day they set apart for God. It was the Jewish day of rest. And he showed up to a synagogue. Now, a synagogue, our closest equivalent to that would be church. Okay? So there was one temple, and where was the temple located? Jerusalem, right? It was the temple. There was one temple, but then in all the outlying communities, there were these synagogues that would show up. In order to have a synagogue, you just needed 10 Jewish men to show up, and they could start a synagogue. And what they would do is on the Sabbath in the synagogue, they would read from the Old Testament scriptures, okay? And then maybe they would have a rabbi that would be there, and they would expound some on those scriptures. So Jesus shows up to one of these in a place called Capernaum, and he shows up, and it's on the Sabbath day, and he just shows up. And the interesting thing here is that as we read the text, can anybody tell me what Jesus said when he showed up to the Sabbath? What was his message? Anybody know? We have no idea. Mark doesn't give us that detail, right? It's kind of interesting. Why? Because what Mark is trying to get across to us is not so much the words that he said, but it was the authority in which he had that he said them. It's the authority that Mark's trying to get across to us, right? He wants them to understand that Jesus has the authority, and he taught as one who had authority, right? Mark here in our passage helps us out a little bit because Mark gives us a little comparison between Jesus and another group of people. At the very end of verse 22, it says that he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So who were the scribes that Mark is comparing Jesus with? Well, the scribes were the religious leaders at that time. They were the ones that would pore over. They were the Bible scholars of the time. They were the ones that would pore over the Old Testament text, that would copy down and make copies of the Old Testament text. They were the religious leaders at the time. In fact, one person said it this way. They said that to understand what the scribes did, they said that they combined the office of Torah professor, so Old Testament law teacher, professor, teacher, moralist, and civil lawyer, right? So they kind of carried all of these roles. They were the ones in the culture that would tell them what the Old Testament text meant. They were the Bible scholars of the time. However, Jesus, as Mark is retelling the story, there's something different about the way that Jesus teaches. You see, Jesus teaches with authority. Jesus teaches very differently than these religious leaders do. Now, also, these scribes at this time were the highest prestigious position that you could have in this community, right? So everybody looked up to the scribes, right? And they had a lot of authority in this community. But then Mark is making this comparing and contrasting Jesus to them and saying that there was something different about the way that Jesus taught. So let's look at the scribes for a minute then. We're talking about this idea of authority. And for the scribes, their authority came from tradition, right? That's where their authority came from, was really from tradition. In fact, many of the Jewish forefathers, many of these scribes, they would just quote other scribes, other religious leaders. And for them, tradition kind of hung as the main source of authority in their life. Yes, they would go to the Old Testament text, but they hung so much of what they did just on this idea of tradition and expounding on the Old Testament. So what they would do is they would take the laws of the Old Testament and they would create additional books and literature on those, further describing those. And those kind of became the authority for themselves. Jesus, on the other hand, is claiming an authority to come directly from God the Father. This is very different, right? This is very different. Jesus' authority is coming directly from the Father. And he says that over and over again. And so as we see this first little introduction to Jesus in this moment, right? What were the people's reaction, right, that were there? What was their reaction? Well, it says that they were astonished, right? They were blown away by what they heard Jesus teaching. They wanted to hear more and more and more, right? There was something different about what Jesus had said. But what we don't need to read into this, okay, what we have to be careful not to read into this text is that just because they were astonished by it did not mean that they changed anything in their lives based on that, on their lives, right? This same group of people, a lot of which that watched this would be the same ones that would be yelling to crucify Jesus just a few years later, okay? So we should never mistake astonishment or amazement or excitement over something with obedience, because that's not what we see in the story. But there was something about the authority of Jesus that just astonished them. They just blew their minds, and they wanted more and more and more. Dwight L. Moody said it this way. He says, there is an awful possibility of being astonished without being convinced, persuaded, or even saved. I think that's true. I think that's a caution for the church today. We can be amazed by some of the things that Jesus says. That doesn't mean that it's going to translate into changing our lives. Right? And that's what we see with the scribes, is because they were so holding on to the authority of tradition. And so thinking about Jesus astonishing the people with what he said, here's something I want us to take a few minutes and think about. What teaching of Jesus has astonished you the most since you have been following him? And then a follow-up to think about that is that, did that lead you to responding? Did that somehow lead you to responding to that? Right? So something that Jesus has said that just astonishes us, and then how's that affected your life ever since you came across that? So let's take a minute or two and think about that, and then we're going to keep going in our story. All right, so what did you guys think about? Was there what teaching of Jesus really astonished you, maybe the first time that you heard it, or it played a big role in your life? Go ahead. Okay, love Forgive. Ooh, yes. Love. Yes. That God loves us, and so we should love other people. Very good, Abby. Follow me. Somebody help me. Is it Y? I? Y? That doesn't look, yeah, well. Anybody who's watched this before knows this is not my gifting. Okay, dying to self. Okay. Yeah, so kind of giving up everything to follow me. Yep. What'd you say? Obedience or disobedience? Obedience? Is that what you said? He's like, I'm on camera now. Present. Yeah, obedience. That's really good. I don't know if that's what you said, but that's really good. Okay, so there's this love and justice nature to Jesus, right? I came to bring the sword. At the same time, love your neighbors, love your enemies. Yeah, these are all like, man, I remember the first time that I truly got some of these. I remember for this one, the first time I understood like what that meant to follow Jesus, that it wasn't no longer about me kind of making Jesus into this person that I wanted him to be, but it was following him, letting him lead and guide my life. Love your enemies, like, man, just revolutionary idea of loving those that hate you and expecting nothing in return. These are absolute amazing teachings, right? And so the authority of Jesus, the words of Jesus should demand authority in our life. But secondly, as we keep reading in the story, we're also going to see that not only was it Jesus' words that demanded authority, but also his power. Jesus' power over darkness demands absolute authority. Let's keep reading. We're going to pick up in verse 23. Okay? And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He even commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. All right, so this really crazy thing happens, right? Jesus is in there teaching, and then all of a sudden, someone who is possessed by an unclean spirit shows up. Now really, this is the best translation, the best way for us to think about this. Someone who was possessed by a demon shows up in the middle of the church service, right? That's what's happening in this moment. Is that someone who has been possessed by this unclean spirit or by a demon is showing up in the middle of the church service, right? Right after Jesus is teaching with authority, right? He speaks up in this moment, and the people are like, "What in the world is going on?" Okay, and so in the text, we're like, one of the questions I think we have to wonder about, and I thought about this week as I was reading this story, is just like, holy moly, like a demon shows up in the middle of church? Like, that just seems like the last place that a demon would be. But when we think about it, right, may not be, right? I had heard one guy, as I was reading, one commentator said it this way: if they made their way into church back then, they probably will do it today as well. And I just thought about that, and I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy, right? And so this demon-possessed man shows up in the middle of this synagogue, right? And Jesus confronts him and calls the demon out. Now, the demon's response, right, here was that they begged to be left alone, right? They begged to be left alone. And I think that's kind of the consistent picture you see in the Gospels, is that when Jesus confronts a demon-possessed person, that demon will always say, "Just leave me alone," right? I don't want people to know what I'm doing. Right? That's the work of the enemy, is it's so under the veil and so in the shadow of darkness, like they don't want attention drawn to what's happening. And yet there's also at the same time, there's this acknowledgement even by the demon as to who Jesus really is and the authority that he has. Right? Look at the demon's response. He says, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." It's interesting that in many ways, the demons recognize who Jesus is in ways that we don't even recognize him or the authority that he has in our life. But yet, that's what's happening in this story. The demons recognize who Jesus is, right? They recognize what he is all about. They recognize this mission that he is on. And the beautiful thing is that with Jesus, the beginning of this conquering of the darkness has begun. God's rescue plan is beginning in the person of Jesus. And we see that Jesus has the authority and the power to cast this demon out of this man. And so when Jesus tells the demon to be silent and to come out, his only response is to obey, right? The power of Jesus over darkness is that when Jesus commands it, the darkness has no response but to obey. Now let's talk about this demon for just a minute, right? Where does the demon's authority lie? Where does the demon's authority lie? Well, we know that the demons are basically led by Satan, right? He is the architect behind this fall of humanity. He's the architect behind all the darkness in the world that we live in. And so where does Satan put his authority, if you would? And I think it goes back to one of the categories we mentioned earlier in this idea of reason, right? The Bible tells us that Satan wanted to be God. He thought that he could be God. And based on that, he led a rebellion of angels, of a third of the angels, against God. And it didn't work out, but yet his authority was his thinking. Satan is always thinking that he can rebel against God, that he can be God, that he can have that place of God. And that's what drove him to that rebellion against God. And so here we see the next category of authority is that idea of reasoning, my thinking. Satan's thinking was that he could be God. And it's interesting then, what is the people's response to this situation, to this casting out of demons? Again, they're blown away by amazement, right? It says they were all amazed and they started asking, what is this, a new teaching with authority? He even commands the unclean spirits and they obey him. Or to put it another way, we need to see more, right? And I feel like there's so many people today that just are wanting to see more of Jesus without actually submitting to the authority that he's claiming to have, right? They just saw Jesus cast a demon out of a person, but yet we don't see any sort of major move of obedience in their life. We just see that they want to see more, right? And so they start to spread the word about Jesus, and it goes throughout all of the region of Galilee. And people are starting to hear what Jesus is doing. Which leads us to our next point, which is that Jesus' power to heal also demands absolute authority. And this is our last story for this morning. This starts in verse 29. It says, "And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick, oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." So now we see there's this next moment, right, where Jesus, and I think Mark is tying all of these together to kind of set up the authority of Jesus. Next we have Peter's mother-in-law, right? And Peter's house kind of becomes the home base for Jesus' ministry for the next 3 years. And again, we see Jesus do something miraculous, right? He heals this woman who is sick. And yet we see that people are amazed by Jesus's ability to heal, Jesus's power over even sickness. People are amazed by it, right? Again, for the third time, the people's response to this is that they wanted to see more. It says that they brought all those who were sick and oppressed by demons, right? They wanted to see more and more and more. We get the same response, but yet we see no obedience in their life. And so where were the people putting their authority at, right? We've looked at the scribes, we've looked at the demons, now just the crowd that has been watching all of this unfold. Where had they put their authority in? And I think what we would say is that they put their authority in experience, right? When I can see what Jesus has done, then I'm going to give him that authority. When I can see these miraculous things happen, I'm going to give him authority in my life. When I can feel it, right? When I've experienced it, when I can feel it, then I'm going to give Jesus that authority in my life. And yet, as we said a few minutes ago, we have to be careful not reading into this that this meant that they were actual true followers of Jesus. They were just caught up in the moment, if you will. They were just excited by what they saw Jesus doing, but it didn't mean that they were truly following him. I want to go back to what D.L. Moody said. I think this is important to insert this in again. He says, "There is an awful possibility of being astonished without being convinced, persuaded, or saved." I think that, especially within the church, right? So much of this context happened in a church setting, in a religious gathering. We have to be careful today that we haven't sat here and we've heard the stories of Jesus. We've heard the claims of Jesus, but yet it's not had any impact on our life. It hasn't affected any part of our life more than just being amazed by something that we heard, more than just being excited on a Sunday morning about the message that the preacher has given to us. Not more than just getting excited when we've heard a worship song and that's we've had this emotional response, but has there been obedience to follow that? So the question is, did anyone get it right in this story? Did they? Is there anybody who got it right in the story? Yes? No? How many of you guys think, yes, there's somebody in the story that got it right? How many think everybody in the story got it wrong? All right, for those of you who said yes, and nobody said no. For everybody who said yes, who got it right in the story? The mother-in-law. right? I love this about the gospel story. There's this beautiful little thread of grace and acknowledgement and understanding of who Jesus is that's sewn right into the story, right? Peter's mother-in-law gets it right. Peter's mother-in-law is the only one that responds in obedience to Jesus. Let's read that part. This is found in verse 31. And he came and he took her by the hand. Let me just stop right there. I love the tenderness of Jesus in this moment, right? He didn't just with some powerful words say, "Be healed," right? But in a very tender, compassionate way, Jesus goes to her. And he takes her by the hand and he lifts her up. This very personal way of healing her. And the fever left. And then her response is, and then she began to serve him. You see, Peter's mother-in-law in that moment wasn't just amazed by what Jesus had done for her, but she got who he truly was. And that led to this place of obedience, right? Her response to the absolute authority of Jesus was to serve. It was to make it about the one who has that authority in her life. And I think she sets up a beautiful example for us today as to how we should respond to the authority of Jesus in our life, right? It's not enough for us just to be amazed by some of the sayings that Jesus has said. It's not enough for us to even be just amazed by the power of Jesus over darkness. It's not enough for us today just to be amazed by the healing that Jesus brings. But if that doesn't translate into obedience in our life, into following through and setting him up as that ultimate authority, then we've missed the mark. I want to go back quickly to how we defined authority. We said authority in our life will determine how we think and how we live. And so if Jesus' authority doesn't change the way that we think about the world and what we do and the way that we live our lives, we've missed him being the absolute authority in our life. And I'm so grateful that Mark included this little sentence in there about Peter's mother-in-law, because she got it. And so today, as we think about this in our lives, I want us to ask the question, what is your source of absolute authority in our life? Right? I want to go back and list those sources of authority we talked about this morning. It should be the next slide on there. There you go. Click through all of them real quick. Sorry. Okay, very cool. Oh, back one more. There we go. Cool. And so this morning, if we have set up reason, the way that we think as the absolute authority, I can't believe in Jesus because it just doesn't make sense from a logical, but science says that God couldn't create everything, right? That just doesn't make sense. If I've set reason up as the absolute authority, this morning I would call you to tear that down in your life. If it's experience, right? Well, I just haven't seen God. If I saw God do the miracles that Jesus did, then I would give him that authority in my life, right? But as we've seen in the story, that is not even enough to make true obedience happen. Well, tradition, we've always done it this way, right? If any of those three sources are our absolute authority in life, I would call us to tear those down and to rebuild on the bedrock of Jesus. If we put anything else in the place of Jesus' authority in our life, we need to tear it down. I want to conclude this morning by just sharing a very brief story. This comes from the year 1014 to 1035. In England, they were ruled by a Danish king named Canute. King Canute was tired of hearing all the people flatter him with such exaggerant phrases and praises of how great his power was. Day in and day out, people would come in and just tell him how great he was as a king and how powerful he was as a king. And so he got tired of just hearing the nonsense over and over and over again. And so one day he decides that he's going to have his throne, his chair, placed out on the beach by the ocean. And many of his followers, many of his royal officials follow him down to the beach. And King Canute stands up there on the seashore and forcibly commands the waves not to come any further. And he does this for hours on end. But no matter how forcible he tries to order the waves to stop coming in, they don't obey him. Soon the waves begin to overtake his chair. And as one historian tells us, that from that day forward, he never wore the crown again, but hung up a statue of the crucified Christ in that place. And I think about that for our lives today. And I wonder how many of us need to take the crown off of, this crown that we've put on ourselves, right, as that absolute authority, and we need to set it aside so that the true king can have that authority in our lives. So how will we respond then to the call to the authority of Jesus today? How will we respond? Well, if Jesus is the ultimate authority, it should impact our relationships in our life, right? Jesus tells us about our relationships, how we should love our enemies, how we should love our neighbors. In our marriages, how we should prioritize one another over ourselves. Does that affect our life? Does Jesus' authority affect our life? How about our time? How about our time, the way that we spend our time? How much of our time is spent on us? How much of our time is spent in growing our relationship with Jesus compared to other things we spend our time on? If Jesus is the authority, it would seem like he should have the majority share of our time. How much time do we spend sharing his love with the world around us? When is the last time that we went out and shared the love of Jesus with somebody who wasn't following him? Right? If we're going to say that Jesus has this authority in our life, right, then we need to be obedient when he calls us to do these things. How about how we spend our money? How about the things that we care about and we invest our lives in? You see, if Jesus is to be the ultimate authority in our life, then it should be him that determines the way that we think and the way that we live our lives.